We're going to be focusing on what is really an increasingly important topic for countries all around the world, and that is the need to safeguard critical infrastructure. And I think it's more than clear that the overall threat to energy infrastructure is increasing due to a number of obvious factors. These include geopolitical risk, higher levels of digitalization, and the availability of more sophisticated IT and other tools as well. And very unfortunately, the number of attacks is growing. We're all aware of Russia's ongoing attacks against Ukraine's energy infrastructure in particular, as well as the high-profile attacks that we've witnessed on the Nord Stream and Baltic connector pipelines. And in Ukraine, just this year, more than 9 gigawatts of generation capacity has been lost between March and May due to ongoing Russian attacks. And rolling blackouts are now a reality of daily life for citizens all across Ukraine. This is, of course, a situation we're monitoring very closely. We sent just a couple of weeks ago our second set of team members out to speak with Ukrainian officials and other stakeholders about the situation on the ground, and we're working very closely with the government, as I know so many of you are, to support their energy sector needs, with a strong focus on power system security, ongoing modeling and capacity building for key stakeholders to achieve a more resilient and flexible energy system. But beyond the very dramatic invisible attacks on physical infrastructure, invisible cyber attacks can have an equally crippling effect on energy systems. The IEA analysis shows that the average number of cyber attacks against utilities each week has more than doubled since 2020, and these incidents are becoming more varied. Cyber attacks not only target the grid operators and generators directly, but also indirectly through malware infiltrated by equipment or services of trusted suppliers. And as the electrification of our energy systems advances, these threats will only become more important and more urgent to address. And making sure the power and heat system stays on, as has been mentioned in the last panel too, is really a critical responsibility and a shared responsibility between governments and electricity system operators, including the private sector. So, given the complexity of our energy systems, we clearly need cross-cutting collaboration between a wide range of power sector and other stakeholders. So, to assist us in discussing these growing challenges and assessing how governments and the private sector can improve information sharing and increase awareness and really look at addressing the challenges that our energy systems are facing, it's really my great pleasure to introduce you to our speakers this morning. Let me start with Josh Foltz, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Europe, Eurasia, Africa, and the Middle East in the Office of International Affairs at the U.S. Department of Energy. Brigadier General Patriche, Deputy Director of the General Directorate of Internal Protection, Minister of Internal Affairs of Romania. And Tom Earl, Chief Commercial Officer at Venture Global LNG, a producer of liquefied natural gas pipelines with global operations. And Justin, I see you've been able to join us just in time, so let me introduce Ambassador Justin Siberell, President for Europe and the Middle East region at Bechtel. So warm welcome to all of you, and thanks so much for taking the time to join us on this panel. So if I may, I'd like to start with you, Josh, to kind of set the broader geopolitical scene for us. In light of the increasing frequency and sophistication of cyber attacks, natural disasters, and extreme weather and geopolitical tensions, how would you describe the current state of critical infrastructure protection within the energy sector in Europe? What do you see as the most significant vulnerabilities? And if you could tell us a little bit about some of the steps you are taking, including through PTEC, such as the projects I know you're doing on cybersecurity workshops and electricity vulnerability assessments to really work to address these challenges. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you, Ambassador Warlick. It's really a pleasure to be here. PTEC has been an incredibly important platform for the United States to connect with our allies in this region over the last 5 years. It's something that we're very proud of. The growth in the cooperation and the collaboration here at PTEC has just been outstanding. I want to give a quick thanks to our Romanian hosts for having us here and putting on such an incredible group of folks to be able to share in experiences and lessons learned. And I think that that's really kind of the heart of where we see our ability to move forward and make progress on securing critical energy infrastructure. And I'm really glad that you talked about the kind of like the two-pronged threat to critical energy infrastructure. One is the invisible threat of cybersecurity attacks, which we've seen obviously multiply significantly over the recent years, but also the real threat that's posed by climate change to the infrastructure that we have, and the need to address both of those threats as we think of a holistic conception of what it means to protect critical energy infrastructure. You know, part of that, I think, is going to really rely on our ability to kind of shift our thinking in terms of how we design systems. And instead of taking systems that are primarily focused simply on the delivery of services or the moving of molecules or electrons, we need to think about designing those systems with a defensive nature in mind from the beginning, rather than trying to come and overlay preventative and defensive measures on top of that. So I think that's a little bit of a mindset shift that we hope to see in terms of the infrastructure and the way that we architect our systems moving forward. As you said, Mary, we have a lot of engagement with our partners in the region to try and enhance the resiliency of our cybersecurity posture. And really, as the network of energy systems continues to become increasingly interconnected, the ability to make sure that every link in that system is resilient, defensible, and in a way that is sustainable is incredibly important, because in any of those systems, you know, we are only as strong as the weakest link. And so we need to make sure that all of our partners have the ability to make sure that that critical energy infrastructure is protected, both from a resiliency standpoint and climate change, but also the malign influence and attacks that we've seen proliferated in recent years, and not the least of which has been highlighted by Russia's persistent and most recent aggression and invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So it's something that's highly complex. It's something we spent a lot of time talking about, and it's something that we see as being necessary to address in a holistic and a systemic manner.
Well, thank you very much for that, and thank you especially for highlighting the real impacts of climate change on our systems, and need to be thinking really very much more smartly as we look ahead to future investments. Brigadier General Patriche, I would like to ask you for a European perspective on this issue. I understand that the EU Council just recently adopted a recommendation on EU critical infrastructure blueprint, promoting information sharing across member states, coordination in public communication, and pooling technical support for an effective response to incidents. And clearly improved coordination is going to be so important. So I'd really welcome your views on how you see this contributing to those kinds of goals, and to what extent you think that there could be additional work done to include the private sector into this kind of important coordination as well. Thank you.
First of all, Mr. Warlick, thank you for the question. It's a very good question, and I'd like to say that I'm really honored to be part of this panel. And I consider this question very important as my background is in the security sector. So the recommendation on blueprint on critical infrastructure incidents with cross-border disruption relevance, I think it was the correct step in order to strengthen our policies on better cooperation among member states to deal with hybrid threats and more that are more complex and that their intensity is higher due to the new technologies and of course of their heavier impact. When we talk about challenges, first of all, we have to implement the critical entities directive at our national level, and I'm happy to say that we are on track with this, and we are the legislation, the project of this legislation passed the Senate, and it's on its way to be approved at national level. Of course, there will be many challenges in listing all these critical entities that are delivering essential services, and this will be, I think, the hardest thing to do, because no longer than I think the Hungarian presidency already asked us how we stand with implementing this directive, and I think they sense that we have problem of having a common understanding of the concept of critical infrastructure, critical entities, and of course the complementarity with the NIS2 directive, which is also, to say so, in the parliament, waiting to be approved. I think it's in the government. It didn't reach the parliament yet. But as I said, I think the main challenges will be confidentiality and security information, because when we talk about critical infrastructure and in terms of vulnerability, no one wants to share this kind of information. So that's why the EU Council came with this recommendation, try to step up the strengthening of cooperation and to find secure ways to share situational awareness and in this and try not to affect the already existing crisis management mechanism, and of course not to hinder with the national security approach of its member states. So this would be the main challenges. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And maybe just a quick follow-up. I will turn to the private sector in just a moment, but did you have additional thoughts on how to coordinate and work with the private sector more in these areas, bearing in mind some of the points you've made about information security? Thank you.
Okay. Talking about critical infrastructure incidents that has a disruptive impact, cross-border disruptive impact of essential services, I think it does raise awareness at the level of private sectors that even the investment in resilience, it's not an efficient investment in short terms. On long terms, I think it will pay off. And of course, we should bear in mind that even the private sector is delivering a part of essential service. When a blackout is happening, the state holds also responsibility together with the private operators. So we did experience that in Romania when we had the energy blackout in the western part of our country, and the Department of Emergency Situation provides sufficient generators that the private operator didn't have because they were located in other country, for example, and we managed to restart our essential health services in that part of the country. So, of course, we do have, for example, in cybersecurity, we have our national strategy that is pointing at the improving or raising awareness by designing exercises and different formats of cooperation and conferences with private sector and university actors. And I think it would be better, for example, critical entities directives has a request for a national strategy to improve resilience for these critical entities, and I'm thinking, and we are already doing this in Romania, that involving private sector in issuing public policies, it's the best way to do it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Let me now turn to the private sector companies that we have with us. And actually, I think I'll go to Justin first, if I may. I think it would be really interesting for the audience to hear from you how you see the role of companies such as Bechtel in relation to governments and operating companies to safeguard critical infrastructure assets. And how do you go about ensuring risk mitigation on the level of individual construction projects as well? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. And I'll add my thanks as well to the Atlantic Council and Department of Energy for organizing the PTEC and the Business Forum, and then also to the government of Romania for hosting us here in Bucharest. I think, as Josh said in his remarks, the protection of critical infrastructure really needs to begin in the planning phase, and it very much is a mindset shift. It needs to be baked into the planning. And from the perspective of a construction company, we come in to deliver the construction of an asset on behalf of the owner, who is also responsible for implementing their own security practices, that they may have developed their own security standards, but also in coordination with federal and local authorities, depending upon the nature of the asset, the nature of the threat that the facility might face. Our role then to come in to construct the facility really begins with awareness. I mean, construction industry, we might be building a project and hiring from the local community, hiring union labor, hiring from the subcontractor community, who may or may not be familiar with the requirements of critical infrastructure protection. So it begins with a basic awareness that those working on the site, those associated with the site, are involved in a project that implicates U.S. national economic security or U.S. national security even. And I'll speak mostly from the perspective of the U.S. construction market for a moment, and I'll make maybe a brief comment in the end about how that might apply more internationally. Of course, from our perspective, we have security site managers that we assign, whose job it is to be aware of the security standards required and implement those standards. They will establish vetting procedures for the people who have access to the site control systems, and then also to liaise closely with the developer, the owner, and then federal authorities in ensuring that those standards are met. It's important to emphasize the role that ongoing interaction with federal authorities plays as we develop the large-scale infrastructure projects, for instance, that my colleague builds the LNG export terminals, which have really now emerged as vital national security assets. It's very important that we have seamless coordination across federal authorities so that we're aware as a construction company, and the owner is aware of the threats that these facilities might be facing. You need reporting mechanisms so that the employees on the site are able to report if they've been approached in suspicious ways, if they get approached off the work site, so that we are protecting against any variety of threats, to include what might become insider threats. Obviously, cyber threats are kind of the moment, given what's happened over the last few days, but also more broadly, we've seen that critical energy infrastructure has been a major target of cyber actors, both state-backed and even hacking groups. So we always have to have we have our own information technology teams that will deploy to a project to ensure that even in our own construction planning and execution model, we have appropriate protections in place. But I think what's really, at the end of it, what's most important on these large complex projects is that we have that layered, interconnected approach, which really begins with the government, setting a policy, establishing policy, and then defining those implementing regulations and standards, and then sharing the information with us in the private sector so that we are able to implement. And then we feed back to the government to ensure that we're all collaborating, cooperating seamlessly. And the comment I would make about the U.S. system, I mean, we've been engaged in these sorts of measures really for the last 20 or so years, and even more, but certainly since 9/11, when there's been a heightened understanding of the threats that might be posed to critical infrastructure. So I think our system is quite well developed between CISA, the DOE, DHS, FBI, other federal agencies, and then the industry itself adopting very rigorous standards. Of course, there are countries in Europe who face persistent threat. Ukraine was mentioned, the Baltic states, which seem to be under constant threat of penetration and high risk to their own facilities. And that probably develops a very strong mindset of collaboration and cooperation. But in those countries where there isn't perhaps the same experience, I think there is a need for more collaboration. Obviously, it's happening at the federal level and the national level at events like this. But we in the private sector also probably could be sharing best practices and ensuring that, you know, we are contributing to broadly more global protection of critical energy infrastructure. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you've touched on a number of points that have already been raised, and I think really point to, the importance in terms of awareness raising, coordination, collaboration, sharing of best practices, so many steps that need to be taken. And Tom, I'd now like to turn to you, speaking from your perspective as a major producer of LNG pipelines, really with truly global operations. How do you see the public and private sector working together to enhance energy security and critical infrastructure, specifically across the LNG supply chain? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you all for the opportunity to be together here in Bucharest on behalf of Venture Global. It's a privilege to be here. Echoing what Justin said just then, I think it's in the planning phase that the public and private partnership really takes its formation. And in our case, building LNG export projects on the coast of Louisiana, it's that initial partnership and the quality and depth of that partnership with the Federal Regulatory Commission and the DOE, which provides the platform to build enormously complex, multi-billion-dollar LNG facilities that provide the critical supplies that the General was talking about. And the depth of that, it's not only, if I can try to emphasize, it's not only a bureaucracy element and in the planning, but it's also in deep engineering and the quality of the engineering oversight that occurs in the United States on LNG infrastructure with the FERC and the DOE, which frankly it's a privilege to work within, because in the end it allows you to innovate. And if you look at what Venture Global's had the privilege to be able to do particularly in the last 2 years, as it's provided LNG to Europe at a particularly critical time for those supplies that have come here over the last 24 months. It was the ability to innovate. Our first plant, Calcasieu Pass, is the first ever plant that's produced significant amounts of LNG during the commissioning and construction phase. That turned out to be exceedingly important. It's hard to overstate that in the last 24 months. That innovation and the fact that it was allowed, the fact that it was encouraged, the fact that it turned up at the right time in the right place in Europe was down to the interaction with the regulatory authorities as well in the United States. And so that's something that is not said very often, but it's really an important sort of base to say about the public-private element. What's also not said very much, and this is a nice platform to say it here in Europe, is that our LNG export plant in the United States is predominantly built in Europe. And if that sounds shocking to you, it's certainly a shock to the LNG industry globally, who are much more used to building LNG plants out of many tens of thousands of components using sometimes 10 or 20,000 people. Again, in partnership with the regulatory authorities in the United States, Venture Global was able to change the way that an LNG plant was built. It did it in a modular way, and that meant that we were able to build the components of the plant here in Europe. Billions of dollars has been spent from these LNG plants in Europe. For example, manufacturing the liquefaction units in Italy, whether it's the power systems in Poland, pipe-in-pipe, complex pipe in France and Belgium, or the gearboxes in France. All across Europe, the quiet story has been that the LNG plants of Venture Global have actually been built predominantly in Europe, meaning many thousands of jobs, enormous billions of dollars of investment in those engineering plants. And Europe can be deeply proud of the fact that despite the pandemic, all of those components were delivered on time to our plants in terms of engineering. Those modular components that turned up, that enabled the plant to start on time, 29 months after the investment was made, the initial investment was made. That enabled all of the key cargoes during 2022 when gas supplies were very limited in Europe. It enabled that critical supply, those critical supplies that the General was talking about, to turn up and support Europe. And frankly, as a result of Europe's engineering facilities being on time. And that's something that Europe, together with the US authorities, can be very, very proud of. That platform of LNG production from our first plant has then led to our second plant, which will come online in the next few months, called Plaquemines, also in Louisiana. To support that and to support European partners of Venture Global who don't have their own ships in order to import that product from Louisiana into their countries in Europe and into the regasification terminals, Venture Global has been fortunate to be able to purchase and therefore control 9 new LNG carriers. It's important that they're new because they have the cleanest technology of the LNG shipping fleet in the world. So on behalf of the United States, these ships will have the lowest methane and CO2 footprint. They have technology on board which is quite mesmerizing in some respects. For example, along the hulls of the vessels there is air bubbles pumped out, which reduces the friction between the water and the vessel. So there are really new innovations on these vessels that will serve Europe's customers that don't have their LNG fleet. That'll be happening from this winter during the construction and commissioning phase again of Plaquemines. So those ships, you will see them come and serve customers, utilities in Europe, also in this region, with LNG from Louisiana. And then lastly, perhaps to say, in terms of critical infrastructure, Venture Global is also supporting regasification in Europe, and as some of you may have seen, we've supported the Isle of Grain terminal in the United Kingdom, which of course is connected to Europe via the Siberell interconnector. So also on regasification, we are trying our best to be in the chain, in the LNG chain, providing regasified LNG, supporting the renewables build out in Europe, which having gas infrastructure to support the intermittency of renewables is the cleanest combination that we can offer our consumers in Europe today. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Tom, for walking us through that. It's really a remarkable story if you think about it, and the transition from reliance on Russian pipeline gas to where we are today is really thanks to so much of the technology and innovation that you've described, as well as really the complexity of it all, which I think is not always well understood. And the complexity means there's a lot of critical energy infrastructure challenges and issues to be thinking about. But the coordination and the work that's gotten to us where we are today is really very, very impressive. I'd now like to come back to you, Josh. We've talked quite a bit already about the importance of collaboration in looking at the protection of our critical energy infrastructure, collaboration between government entities and the private sector, and including all of the legislation, regulation that's involved. But what do you see as the key challenges and opportunities in really fostering this cooperation, which is going to only become more and more important as threats continue to grow? And how do you see both sectors being able to improve their strategies to better harden and defend energy infrastructure assets? I know this is a very big question, but we very much welcome your views. Thank you.
Thanks, Ambassador Warlick. Look, I think we've heard a lot from the distinguished panelists here that hinges upon how important it is for the private sector and the public sector to coordinate on these issues. And so I think there are three elements that are absolutely foundational to our ability to really solidify that relationship and that dynamic. And the first is communication. We have to talk to each other. There has to be open dialogue about some very, very sensitive topics. That communication has been ensconced in a number of the platforms and facilities that we have at the Department of Energy. We have the energy security groups that we deal with that have embedded private sector and public sector experts that meet on a regular basis. The Biden-Harris administration launched NSM, National Security Memorandum 22, which again codified the way that the public sector and the private sector can and must interact on critical energy infrastructure protection issues. The second thing that we have to do is we have to be consistent in that communication. This is not a static operation. This is something that, as has been noted multiple times on this panel, is a constantly evolving and morphing threat. And so that conversation has to be consistent. It cannot be a one and done situation. We have to consistently come back to that conversation, refresh what we're seeing from a public sector perspective and the lessons that are being learned by our private sector partners. Neither one of us are going to be able to really address this complex and ever-evolving threat in isolation, and so we have to really be consistent in that communication. And then the third element of this, I think, that is foundational is creativity. We have to be creative, not just in terms of the solutions that we bring to these challenges and these threats, but how we deploy those solutions and how we come to developing those solutions in partnership with our private sector allies and partners. Our national laboratory system at the Department of Energy really sits at the heart of the capacity that we bring to the table to be able to sit on a technical basis and work with our private sector partners who are engaging on the front lines of these threats on a daily basis in terms of what's needed and what the future may bring. Ultimately, the goal is to stay ahead of the curve and to not be reactive. And I think part of that has been addressed again in Ambassador Siberell's comments about really baking this conception of critical energy infrastructure protection in from the beginning so that we're not constantly playing catch up. But because, as it's been mentioned numerous times, the complexity and the speed with which this challenge continues to present itself, we're never going to be able to rest on our laurels. So that communication, that consistency, and that creativity is absolutely essential.
Thank you very much. Very important points, and really good to hear about all that the U.S. is doing in that regard, and of course the continued investment in and the work being done by the national labs on innovation technology to help address these challenges is going to be really critical. Brigadier General Patriche, I'd like to come back to you. I know you've already talked a little bit about the importance of public-private sector cooperation on this matter. But this requires bringing together relevant actors from the energy sector with the security sector. And just in very practical terms, I wonder if you can describe a little bit more how this can be organized, what you're doing here in Romania, and any best practices that you can share with us in relation to the way in which you're developing major energy infrastructure projects. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll begin with two practical examples. When we are talking about ransomware cyber attacks, talking from experience, the private sector does not have the capacity and to fight or to prepare for really significant ransomware cyber attack. That's why the states are partnering together in international alliances to counter criminal groups that are launching ransomware cyber attacks. We all know that data is very important for everybody in this era, so not being able to restart your services because you lost your data or you don't have the money to pay the ransom to get them back. I think this will be a drive for the private sector to go to the public sector and maybe try to not be so, to have a secrecy about their commercial confidentiality and let the security experts be part of the team that are trying to solve the cybersecurity incident. From the opposite side, we've also experienced a situation when during a cybersecurity incident, we called for the private sector experts because there is where innovation and research is, and they do have powerful tools that can help the public experts to manage cybersecurity incidents. Now, going to a hybrid spectrum of hostile activities, let's not forget disinformation. If a private operator confronts with disinformation, for sure it would be better for him to have as his partner the public sector, because we talk about critical infrastructures, any threat to critical infrastructure in a national point of view, it is a national security threat. So we are preparing constantly for countering and preventing this kind of threats, and for sure we will be able to be of much help in countering disinformation, for example. And we do have lessons learned in Romania. And of course, as I mentioned to the previous question, we do pay attention to the necessity of constantly raising awareness and training together, and that's why earlier than last week we conducted a tabletop exercise that involved private sector and in a very hybrid scenario and with a very important energy project relevant for Romania and I'll say regional importance. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for talking a little bit about what you're doing with respect to cyber attacks. And I think it is a really good example of an area where private and public sector collaboration is really so important. I think your point too on raising awareness, as has already been mentioned, just couldn't be more important and certainly timely. I think was briefly alluded to, but we had such very concerning example of disruptions to global IT infrastructure assets less than a week ago, and just how impactful they can be. So raising awareness to the possibility of these unexpected events is certainly really very important. Justin, I'm going to come back to you again, and we've talked about the increasing sophistication of cyber attacks and threats to infrastructure, and wanted to ask you, as you look at your operations at Bechtel, how you look at sort of the full range of threats, how they're taken into account in safeguarding your projects, and could you reflect a little bit on some of the innovative solutions or technologies that are being adopted by companies such as yours to enhance the security of critical infrastructure? Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Mary. I guess the first observation I would make is that the categories of what is considered to be critical infrastructure are already quite broad. I mean, the CISA, which is the U.S. government's cyber sort of defense organization, has identified 16 different sectors, and Bechtel is currently active in at least 10 of those. We're constructing projects like LNG, export terminals, commercial nuclear facilities, defense industrial facilities, transport projects, advanced manufacturing, among others, each of which falls into one of those 16 categories. So the spread and the reach of what we might consider to be critical infrastructure is already broad, but it's also growing as we see this emphasis upon the onshoring and nearshoring of supply chains. As Tom mentioned, if you're modularizing construction of a vital project in the US and Europe, that means that the supply chain in Europe needs to be secured just as the supply chain in the nearby area needs to be secured. Same thing for the importance upon energy security. As these become really key focus areas of national governments impacting national security, I think the threat levels will rise. I mean, the attack on the Colonial Pipeline a couple of years ago is a pretty good example of this. This was an attack on a network that really shut down the United States gas distribution network for a very uncomfortable number of days, and had all kinds of ripple effects into the American economy. And that kind of attack is, once people see the impacts, I mean, that becomes attractive for others, and not least, I think, from state actors who will look to disrupt the effort that we're all making currently to harden and ensure that we have access to the key materials and the energy we require. One area that we are increasingly involved in as a company is in the area of advanced manufacturing. We are building semiconductor fabrication plants in the United States and pursuing that work elsewhere around the world. Now, there's a great emphasis upon manufacturing of semiconductors. These advanced semiconductors that will power AI into the future are really only built in a few countries around the world. And so those projects, and the output will impact countries' national security. So those are the kinds of projects that really need to be protected, again, just as we protect our critical energy infrastructure. Technology systems to defend against the kinds of attacks you're talking about, particularly sophisticated cyber attacks, require a lot of investment in research. I mean, Bechtel established a cyber lab decades ago because we began to see the leading edge of cyber attacks affecting the kinds of projects we're involved in. And I would say that we are of the size and the experience to be able to maintain that kind of an effort. Also, we have projects in where we work directly for the U.S. government on sensitive projects in the defense and in the energy fields. And we've been able to take some of the learnings from those projects and bring those into our private sector work. But I would say that we're relatively unique in that regard. Not all companies have that kind of capability to bring in and resource a dedicated cyber lab. So for those companies that maybe need capacity building or some awareness of the threats, I think that's another area where we can all collaborate to ensure that for these projects determined to be of national security importance, everyone involved, to include the contractors, are equally capable of addressing and implementing the required safety standards.
Great, thank you very much. And Tom, I'm going to ask you a similar question from your company's perspective. What emerging threats do you see on the horizon, particularly concerning, once again, LNG infrastructure and projects? And how do you, as a company, ensure that a cohesive sort of strategic approach is taking to mitigate these emerging, both climate-related and man-made threats? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Look, I think safety and security remain the foundation, the license to operate for any LNG exporter, and our continuous operations to supply liquefied gas in a stable manner is the key point there. So safety and security remain at the highest level on our agenda, and implementing the procedures that result in those plants, and Calcasieu Pass, Plaquemines, and CP2 on having the highest standards is the most important thing. That goes for hardware, software, personnel, and so on. And of course that extends to shipping as well. And now when we think about LNG shipping around the world, of course there are sensitive areas, there are difficult areas to pass through, currently the Straits of Hormuz, for example. And so we need to be cognizant of that as the ships of Venture Global move around. And that's at the front of our mind in the same way it is for all LNG shippers. It points to the need for diversity. It points to the flexibility of LNG is to make sure that it navigates, so to speak, around challenges that occur in the world. So LNG as a product anyway is clearly a very good tool from a national security point of view, and the diversity of that liquefied supply arriving alongside pipeline supplies is the right approach. And then maybe lastly, I think we all need to be cognizant about, at least on our side, and I'm sure it's the case in perhaps the nuclear industry as well, or other critical supply industries, of the threat of misinformation. I think we should be realists about that. There has been, for gas, a high level of misinformation about liquefied gas and of course regasified LNG, and where it fits in the energy picture. As renewables build out, we have a choice in the world of how to complement those renewables and balance them on the electric grid, whether you choose coal or you choose gas, and of course nuclear as it builds out and arrives, and in full complement to Romania for its emerging nuclear program. But gas has a significant role to play. It's important that the right data points are available and supported when it comes to the nature of where that gas is coming from, the origin of that gas, and the way in certain countries like America enormous efforts have been made to improve the way gas is produced. And yet, of course, for those that want to provide alternative facts about that, we just need to be cognizant, I think, in the industry and in these kind of communication forums about making sure that the real facts get there, because as has been shown in the last 2 or 3 years, projects that provide LNG, and certainly our next project, CP2, which is, has customers in Europe who are waiting for those critical supplies to arrive from 2027 onwards. Those kind of projects are very, very important. And so we need to play our role on the information side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and those are all really important additional points. Thank you also for touching on what is, I know, an ongoing challenge with respect to shipping and lanes and the geopolitical threats that are impacting the movement of those cargoes. I want to ask if any of our panelists have any last words, anything we haven't touched on? Right. Okay, well, I just really want to thank all of you for participating here. I think this has been a really fruitful discussion, not only about identifying the threats, which I think many of us are aware of, and yet you highlighted a lot of them that sometimes we forget about. I think complexity was one point that you had made, Tom. It really is a challenging world that we live in, but what we can try to do with these kinds of discussions is identify approaches and ways in which we can best mitigate and deal with the ongoing challenges. We heard about the importance of diversification. That I think is critical in terms of ongoing energy security, but raising awareness, improving coordination and communication, and really strengthening our public sector collaboration and partnership and information sharing on these challenges, really thinking ahead as we're building new infrastructure as well. That'll really be fit for the future is so important. So let me just end by thanking all of you and invite the audience to give a warm round of applause to our panelists. Thank you.